There's an old superstition in our town. When a family is twins, one child is punished, so the other learns from their mistakes. That is how you keep them in line and make sure they grow up safe. I am born 4 minutes before my sister, Jewel Skinner, so I become the one who pays for her wrongdoings. When Jewel sneaks off to swim in the river, Mom doesn't yell at her once. Instead, she holds my head down and forces it underwater repeatedly. Mom doesn't let go until Jewel is crying and screaming, "I'll never go swimming there again." Once, Jewel forgets to cook the pasta. When Mom gets home from work, the package is still sitting on the counter. So Mom puts 2 bowls of uncooked pasta in front of me and says, "Eat it all. Don't leave a single piece." The dry pasta cut the inside of my mouth until it bleeds. Mom watches Jewel's reaction the whole time. She doesn't take the bowls away until Jewel starts crying. For 16 years, I am the one who pays for Jewel's mistakes. Then, that year, a hurricane heads straight for us. The evacuation orders come that night, and the whole town is told to leave. Jewel stays out with her friends until the middle of the night. When she finally comes home, she is soaked through and still laughing. Mom shoves her into one of the evacuation vehicles. Then she turns to me and says calmly, "You stay here. Once the hurricane passes, Jewel will know better than to come home late again." Everyone in town is gone, and roof tiles begin flying off one after another. "Mom, you always make me suffer, so Jewel learns her lesson. This time I really am going to die. Are you satisfied now?" Where did Jewel run off to now? "We're getting hit by a major hurricane tonight," my mom, Lucinda Parker, said. She paced back and forth through the living room. It was already pitch black outside. The wind sent a metal basin rolling across the yard, clanging against the base of the wall. The town's emergency broadcast had already sounded 3 times. Red alert. Evacuate the entire town. Evacuation vehicles will arrive at the town entrance in 20 minutes. Mom whipped around to face me. She looked furious as she snapped, "You, get out there and find Jewel." I looked out the window. The rain wasn't just falling, it was coming down in sheets. The palm trees were nearly bent to the ground. The chicken coop by the wall had blown over, and several chickens flapped widely as they scrambled under the eaves. "Mom," Jewel said she went to a friend's house. "With the weather outside." Mom cut me off. "Like I care whose house she went to. Go get her now. If you can't find her, don't come home." I instinctively looked at Dad sitting in the corner, who started to speak up. "The wind really is too strong. Maybe we should wait a little." "Shut the hell up," Mom barked, not even turning around. "If something happens to Jewel, can you take responsibility?" Dad fell silent. I slipped on my shoes, the soles already coming apart. The moment I opened the door, the wind nearly knocked me off my feet. I felt my way along the wall, stumbling through water that was already ankle deep. I was about to head to the west side of town, where Jewel's friend lived, when a giggle came from behind me. "Wow, the wind feels so good." I turned around. My sister, Jewel Skinner, came running out of the alley. Her wet hair was plastered to her face, and she looked thrilled. At some point, Mom had already rushed to the door. She pulled Jewel into her arms and checked her from head to toe. Mom's voice was full of relief and worry. "You're finally home. Are you soaked? Are you cold? Get inside and change before you catch a cold." I stood in the pouring rain, soaked through and shivering in the wind, but Mom didn't even spare me a glance. Just then, the evacuation vehicle arrived. Its headlights cut through the rain as the loudspeaker blared again and again. "Everyone, get in now. Evacuate immediately." Mom wrapped Jewel in a blanket and put her in the back seat. I followed behind them and moved to step onto the running board. "What are you doing?" Mom stopped me. "You know the rules." Jewel stayed out having fun and nearly didn't make it home tonight. "Stay here. That'll teach her what it means to be afraid." I froze. Jewel panicked inside the vehicle. She pressed against the window and screamed, "Mom, no. Don't leave Alice here. Something bad will happen to her. The hurricane." "So now you're scared? Why didn't you think of that when you went out?" Mom cut her off sharply. "Alice is being punished because of you." Jewel shrank back, tears streaming down her face. One of the other residents, unable to take it anymore, said, "Mrs. Skinner, this is a Category 5 hurricane. People could die. That old house of yours won't stand a chance." Mom didn't budge as she turned and ran back inside. When she came out, she was carrying our dog, Goldie. She put Goldie in the last empty seat, as if she had every right to. "Goldie's an animal. He doesn't know how to find shelter, so I have to take him too." Then she looked at me and said, "Alice, you're a person. You know how to find somewhere to hide." Dad sat in the front seat, looking as if he had something to say. But when Mom gave him a sideways look, he turned toward the window. The doors to the vehicle closed. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw Jewel pounding desperately on the glass, her mouth moving as she screamed something. But the wind was too loud, and I couldn't hear her. Mom held Jewel's head down, so she couldn't look at me. The engine started. The taillights left 2 red streaks through the downpour, growing farther and farther away.
Soon they were out of sight.
As the lights of Larkton slowly went out, I was left standing alone in the storm. Suddenly, someone shouted from the darkness, "I've got a seat." The voice came from the last vehicle. I squinted through the rain, but I could barely see anything. A hunched figure leaned out from behind the door and waved at me. It was Logan Zane from next door. Logan had no children. His wife died a long time ago, and he had lived at the edge of town his whole life. For as far back as I could remember, he had always treated me like his own granddaughter. Whenever Mom punished me by not letting me eat, he would wait until she wasn't looking and slip a bowl of hot oatmeal through the back door. Every year on our birthday, he gave Jewel and me some spending money. He always slipped an extra $10 into mine when no one was looking. Logan squeezed out of his seat to make room for me and called out, "Come on, Alice. There's enough room. Just squeeze in." I ran toward the vehicle, where Logan was already reaching out to pull me in. Just as my fingers were about to touch his, I heard someone yell, "Logan is a kidnapper." Mom's voice suddenly came from the vehicle in front. At some point, she had rolled down the window and leaned halfway out. She pointed at Logan and screamed, "He's trying to kidnap my daughter. Don't let her get in his car." My hand froze in midair. Logan was at a complete loss for words. He was 72 years old and had lived in this town his entire life. No one had ever called him that before. "Lucinda, what are you saying?" Logan's voice trembled.
"I'm Logan Zane.
"I've lived next to your family for years. When your father was alive, he used to treat me like family." "I don't care who you are," Mom yelled. "You're an old man living alone, and you're way too interested in Alice. Who knows what you're really after?" Everyone in the vehicle erupted in protest. "Mrs. Skinner, have you lost your mind? Mr. Zane has known you your whole life." "Exactly. How can you say something like that?" An older woman stood up and shouted, "This is a Category 5 hurricane. Your roof will blow off in one gust. Are you trying to get Alice killed?" Logan's lips turned pale with anger. He pointed at Mom, his hand shaking badly. "I'm kinda Alice, because I feel sorry for her. Everyone in this town knows how you treat her. Alice is my daughter. How I raise her is none of your business." Mom didn't even flinch as she said that. She's safest in her own home. I stood in the pouring rain and looked at the vehicle Mom was in. In the passenger seat, I saw Dad's hand rest on the door handle. Mom slowly turned to look at him. "If you dare open that door, I'm taking Alice and Jewel to my parents' house tomorrow. You'll never see them again." Dad slowly let go of the handle, one finger at a time. He turned away and didn't look at me again. I stood there as rain poured over me, running into my eyes. I couldn't tell if it was rainwater or something else. The evacuation team captain jumped out of the first vehicle. He looked at the sky and went pale. "The hurricane I will hit in an hour. If we don't leave now, no one gets out." 2 townspeople dragged Logan back into the vehicle. He clung to the doorframe and shouted at me, "Alice, run. Get to the old church at the edge of town. It's built of brick. It can hold up. Do you hear me? Run to the church." Someone pulled the door shut from inside, and one engine after another roared to life. I stood frozen to the spot, watching the taillights disappear one by one. In the end, the last one disappeared too. The entire town of Larkton went dark. I turned and ran toward the edge of town. The church Logan mentioned was at the very end, past a long old street. The wind was too strong for me to run, so I had to brace myself against the walls with every step. Roof tiles were ripped off one by one and shattered on the ground. The wind tore a huge old tree out by the roots and sent it crashing into the middle of the street, completely blocking the road. I had no choice but to go back home. Half the roof was already gone. Rain poured straight inside, flooding the living room. I curled up in the corner under the kitchen counter. The 3 sides were made of brick, and the concrete slab above gave me just enough cover. Water poured in through the gaps in the door and walls. It rose past my ankles, then up to my calves. I hugged my knees and curled into a ball, shivering so hard my teeth chattered. Just then, my phone rang in my pocket. It was Jewel calling. Her voice was shaky with tears as she said, "Alice, are you okay? Where are you?"
"I'm okay."
I gritted my teeth to keep my voice from trembling. "Did you make it?"
"Yeah.
"We're at the emergency shelter hotel in the city. There's hot water and blankets. The staff even made us some tea," she replied. Jewel started sobbing again. "Alice, I'm so scared. What are you going to do, all alone at home?" A deafening crash came from above me. The other half of the roof had been torn away. Wind and rain rushed inside, soaking me from head to toe. I screamed and nearly dropped my phone. Alice, what happened? What was that? Jewel yelled. It's nothing. The wind just blew off bits of the roof. I replied. The signal started cutting in and out, and Jewel's voice kept breaking up. Alice, can you hear? The signal came back, but there was only one bar. I could hear Jewel crying out on the other end of the line.
Mom.
The house around Alice is collapsing. You have to do something. Then I heard Mom say, if she can still make a phone call, she's fine. You're always making a big deal out of nothing. The water rose past my knees. Mom, this isn't nothing. Didn't you hear that? Alice is. Mom cut Jewel off. What could happen to Alice at home? Your dad rebuilt that kitchen counter 2 years ago. It's sturdy. If she can't handle a little wind and rain, how is she ever going to make it on her own? Dad's voice came quietly from the other end. Maybe we should have someone go back and check. What do you even know? Mom shut him down. Then she said to Jewel, that's enough. Tell Alice to hang up. She's wasting money on the call. I crouched in the water, without saying a word. It had already reached my thighs. The one bar of signal kept flickering on the top of the screen. Jewel was still crying as she told me between sobs, Alice, try to get somewhere higher. Just then, an unfamiliar man's voice came through. He sounded urgent and alarmed. Miss, who are you talking to? Jewel sobbed. It's my sister. She's still at home. She didn't evacuate. What? The man's voice rose sharply. There's still someone back there? Where are your parents? There's already a flash flood warning for that area. People could die. Chaos broke out on the other end, and I heard several people talking at once. Someone shouted, get the rescue team. Another asked, how many more are still back there? That man's voice cut through the chaos. Are her parents here? I need this kid's parents over here. How could you leave a child behind? Mom's voice came through at that moment. Alice will be fine. She's tough. The call ended after that. At the same time, the signal was completely gone. The light from my phone went out too. Mom's last words kept echoing in my head. Soon, the water reached my waist, then my chest. There was less and less room beneath the kitchen counter. I clung to the brick pillar beneath it, digging my nails into the cracks. It was so cold. The water was freezing, and the wind was icy. I was chilled to the bone. I remembered one time when Jewel refused to wear a jacket because she wanted to play outside. In the end, she caught a cold. That night, Mom made me stand outside in my pajamas in the middle of winter. She only let me back in when my fever reached 104 degrees, and Jewel broke down crying. This cold was 100 times worse than that winter night. The water rose past my neck. I couldn't hold on to the brick pillar anymore, for my fingers had no strength left. I gave up and stopped struggling. Mom said I was tough, but I wasn't as tough as she thought. I couldn't hear anything anymore, and my consciousness had started slipping away. Just before I blacked out, someone shouted from nearby, she's here. The volunteers pulled me onto a rescue boat. After 3 rounds of CPR, I finally coughed up water and had a faint heartbeat. When we got to the hospital in the city, the ER doctor took one look at me before his expression turned grim. Patient experienced drowning and prolonged oxygen deprivation. Her lungs are full of fluid. Prepare to intubate and notify the operating room. Then he shouted into the hallway. Where's her family? We need a family member to sign. Footsteps came from down the hall. Mom walked over without a hint of urgency. Who told you to save her? Everyone was stunned. She's still alive, isn't she? I bet she's faking it. She's been pretending since she was little, Mom said. A nurse was the first to react. She snapped. What did you just say? If we'd gotten there 30 seconds later, she would have died. Sign the surgical consent form now. If you delay any longer, no one can save her. Mom ignored the nurse. She turned to Jewel, who was standing in the corner. Jewel's face was ghostly white. Her lips trembled, but she couldn't get a word out. Mom looked at her and spoke calmly. Have you learned your lesson yet? Jewel nodded frantically. Her tears fell onto the floor. Nodding isn't enough, Mom said. She pulled a pen from her purse, grabbed a sheet of paper from the nurse's station, and slapped it in front of Jewel. Write a 300-word apology. Once you're done and admit what you did wrong, I'll sign the consent form. The nurse shouted. Are you out of your mind? That child inside is waiting for surgery. Every minute you delay. Mom cut her off without even looking at her. I'm disciplining my daughter. It's none of your business. Then she pulled up a chair, sat down, and took out her phone to scroll through short clips. The doctor rushed out of the ER again. The patient's family. Have you signed the surgical consent form yet? No one answered him. Jewel was bent over the hallway bench, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. She wrote one word at a time, stopping whenever tears fell onto the paper and blurred the ink. She stopped and looked up at Mom, saying, "Mom, please just sign it first." This whole thing wasn't Alice's fault. It wasn't her fault. Mom didn't even look up from her phone. But she has to pay the price, so you'll remember what you did wrong. If you have time to argue with me, you have time to finish writing. Jewel bit her lip, then she lowered her head and kept writing. Her trembling hand made her writing crooked, and every line was soaked with tears before she could finish it. Dad glanced at the sign outside the ER, then at Mom, who was still sitting there scrolling through her phone. "Lucinda, that's enough. Just sign it." "Alice is. You always say that's enough." Mom finally looked up. "That's why Jewel never learns. Stay out of it." Dad fell silent.
Just then, Jewel stopped writing.
She slid off the bench and collapsed onto the floor, holding up the tear-stained paper. "Mom, I'm done. Please save Alice. Please." Mom took the paper from her and read it carefully. She said, "Your handwriting is still a little sloppy. That won't do for your exams, but I'll let it go this time." Mom folded the paper, put it in her purse, and slowly stood up. She looked toward the ER operating theater, almost sounding wistful. This time, Alice really suffered. But if it taught you a lesson, then her punishment was worth it. Once this hurricane passes, I'll buy her a couple of new dresses to make it up to her. I'm just doing this for her own good. Mom turned to the nurse and picked up a pen. "Bring me the surgical consent form." Just then, the light above the ER went out. The doctor walked out and removed his mask. "There's no longer any need to sign the surgical consent form. We couldn't save the patient. She's gone." The pen in Mom's hand didn't fall. She simply held it in midair, her fingers clamped so tightly around the plastic casing that her knuckles turned white. "What do you mean gone?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of panic, carrying only the sharp irritation she usually reserved for when the grocery store ran out of milk. "Stop exaggerating. She's 16. She held her breath in the bathtub for 2 minutes when she was 9, just to be stubborn. Go back in there and pump her chest again." The doctor looked at her not with anger, but with an exhaustion so heavy it seemed to sink his entire frame. Her lungs ruptured from aspirated water.
"Mom."
The prolonged hypothermia caused irreversible cardiac arrest. "We gave her 4 rounds of epinephrine. We shocked her heart 5 times. There is no electrical activity. She is dead." "She's faking it," Mom said immediately, stepping forward, the pen still poised. To sign the blank consent form the nurse held. "She heard you coming out.
She's
doing this to get back at me because I left her behind. Bring me inside."
1.
Slap, and she'll sit right up. "Ma'am, do not touch that door," a male nurse said, stepping firmly between Mom and the swinging double doors of the operating room. Beside her, Jewel didn't scream. A scream requires breath, and Jewel had none left.
She was still on her knees on
the linoleum, her hands clutching the damp, crumpled piece of paper where she had scrawled her 300-word repentance. Her mouth hung open, a strange, choked rasping sound scraping out of her throat like dry leaves dragged across asphalt. "Alice," Jewel whispered. The word barely carried 3 inches. "Alice." "Jewel, stand up," Mom commanded, not looking down at her. "Don't embarrass yourself in front of these people. The doctors here are incompetent. We're going to transfer her to the Central Hospital downtown." "Lucinda," Dad murmured. He had finally gotten up from the plastic waiting
chair.
His hands were trembling so violently he had to shove them into his jacket pockets, but even through the fabric, you could see the spasms. "Lucinda," the doctor said. "Shut up, Arthur." Mom snapped, whipping her head around. "You've always been
soft.
If she dies, it's because she didn't have the will to live, not because of a little water. But she isn't dead. She's my daughter. I know her tricks." She shoved past the male nurse with a sudden, feral strength. The nurse stumbled back, shouting for security, but Mom had already kicked open the double doors. I was there, lying on the narrow stainless steel table under the harsh fluorescent grid. My body didn't look like me anymore. My skin was the color of curdled milk, mottled with dull purple bruising along my jaw and collarbone where the cold had settled. My dark hair was still dripping, pooling into a drain trench at the foot of the gurney. The plastic intubation tube was taped crookedly across my lips, but the machine beside me was silent, its green lines stretched taut and flat across the monitor. Mom marched right up to the table. She looked down at my face, her chest heaving. Alice, she said, her voice dropping into that low, venomous tone she used whenever I didn't finish weeding the yard before sunset. Get up. Stop this nonsense right now. Look at your sister out there. She's terrified. You've made your point. Get up. Silence. I said, get up. Mom grabbed my shoulder and shook me. My head rolled limply to the left. A trickle of clear, brackish floodwater leaked from the corner of my mouth, running across my cheek and dripping onto the green hospital sheet. Mom froze. Her hand remained on my shoulder, but I could feel the cold of my flesh seeping through the wool of her cardigan, biting into her palm. Flesh that doesn't push back. Flesh that has lost all its resistance. Alice? She said, and for the first time in 16 years, her voice broke. Behind her, 2 hospital security guards burst into the room, followed by the lead doctor and 2 city police officers who had been stationed in the emergency wing for storm management. Get your hands off the deceased, ma'am, the older police officer said, his hand resting on his utility belt. Step away from the table right now. Mom didn't step away. She turned around slowly, her face twisted into a mask of
pura indignación.
She's my child. I have the right to discipline her. You tell her to wake up. Tell her she's going to get the belt if she doesn't open her eyes right now. Officer, the doctor said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage as he pointed at the paper clutched in Mom's purse. The patient arrived with a pulse.
We
needed immediate surgical intervention to relieve tension, pneumothorax, and drain the pleural cavity. This woman refused to sign the consent form for 22 minutes while forcing her other child to write an apology letter. We have the hallway surveillance footage. We have the timestamps. The police officer looked from the doctor to Mom, then down at my blue, swollen feet resting on the metal gurney. His eyes hardened into ice. Ma'am, the officer said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt with a sharp, metallic click. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Jewel didn't leave the hospital floor. When the police led Mom away in handcuffs, Mom shouting all the while that this was a family matter, that the law had no right to interfere with how a mother kept her children safe, Jewel remained on the floor by the wall, curled into a tight knot. Dad sat 2 feet away from her, staring blankly at his own shoes. Jewel, Dad said after an hour of silence. We have to go to the shelter. They're serving soup. Jewel didn't answer. Jewel, your mother, she didn't mean for this to happen. You know how she is. She just wanted you to learn. You shouldn't have stayed out so late with those kids from school. Jewel slowly turned her head. Her eyes were bloodshot, the whites mapped with broken capillaries from crying. She looked at Dad not with grief, but with a horrifying, dead-eyed clarity. You had your hand on the door handle, Jewel said. Dad flinched. What? In the car. When Logan offered to take Alice. Jewel's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the hum of the hospital ventilation like a razor. You had your hand on the door handle. You were going to let her in.
And Mom
said she'd take us away, so you let go. Jewel, I couldn't, your mother would have. You let go, Jewel repeated. She stood up slowly, her knees cracking.
Mom
killed her with a pen, but you killed her with your hands in your pockets. Dad reached out to touch her arm, but Jewel pulled away violently, as if his skin were coated in lye. She walked toward the nurse's station. The nurse who had argued with Mom earlier was sitting at the counter, filling out post-mortem intake forms with red-rimmed
eyes.
When she saw Jewel approach, her expression softened into deep, aching
pity.
Sweetheart, the nurse said, standing up. Do you need some water? A blanket? Where is she going? Jewel asked. They've moved her down to the morgue in the basement. The medical examiner has to conduct an autopsy because it's an active criminal investigation. Jewel reached into her pocket. She pulled out the crumpled sheet of paper. On it were 300 words of forced guilt. I am sorry for staying out late. I am sorry for making Mom worry. I am sorry for being selfish. I promise to obey every rule. I promise to be a good daughter. Can you put this with her? Jewel asked. The nurse looked at the paper, then looked at Jewel. What is it, honey? It's the price of her life, Jewel said calmly. Mom wanted it written before Alice could breathe. Alice paid for it, so it belongs to her. The nurse covered her mouth with both hands, a choked sob escaping her throat. She couldn't take the paper. She just shook her head, tears spilling down her
cheeks.
Jewel didn't cry anymore. She folded the paper into a neat, sharp square, took a book of matches from the smoking receptacle by the entrance doors, walked out. Into the gray, storm-washed dawn, and struck a match. The paper burned slowly in the damp morning air. The edges blackened, curled, and turned to gray ash that the trailing winds of the Category 5 hurricane swept across the wet pavement of the city. 2 days later, the floodwaters receded. The highway back to Larkdon was cleared of fallen power lines and uprooted pines. By mid-afternoon, a government bus brought the displaced residents back to inspect what was left of their lives. Larkdon was a graveyard of splinters and mud. Half the houses had lost their roofs. The ancient weeping willows that lined the creek had been snapped like toothpicks. But the people were alive. They stepped off the buses with toolboxes and trash bags, checking on their neighbors sharing bottled water, weeping over ruined family photo albums. Then the Skinner pickup truck rolled slowly down the main road. Arthur Skinner was driving. Beside him in the passenger seat sat no one. In the back sat Jewel, staring out the mud-splattered window. The truck stopped in front of what used to be our home. The house was gutted. The front door had been torn off by the surge. The corrugated roof was draped over the neighboring fence like wet cardboard. Under the kitchen counter, the sturdy concrete slab Dad had built 2 years ago, a deep pool of brown, foul-smelling silt had settled, filled with rotting insulation, dead leaves, and the waterlogged carcass of our old blender. A crowd had already gathered near Logan Zane's house. Logan's porch had lost its awning, but his brick chimney still stood. When Logan saw Arthur get out of the truck, he dropped the shovel he was
holding.
The 72-year-old man didn't walk, he ran. He stumbled through the mud, his boots sloshing heavily, until he reached the Skinner driveway. "Where is she?" Logan demanded, his chest heaving, his weathered face gray with
dread.
"Arthur, where is Alice?" "I went to the evacuation shelter in the city. They said she wasn't on the registry." "Where is the girl?" Arthur didn't look at him. He stood by the open truck door, his shoulders hunched, staring at the mud. She didn't make it, Logan," Arthur mumbled. The street went completely silent. Mrs. Gable, who was sweeping glass off her porch 3 houses down, stopped her
broom.
The 2 town councilmen inspecting the downed transformer looked over. "What did you say?" Logan whispered. "The house." "The water rose too fast," Arthur stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "The rescue team got there, but her lungs—"
"She passed at the
hospital." "You lying son of a bitch," Logan roared. It was a sound no one in Larkdon had ever heard from the gentle old man. He lunged forward, grabbing Arthur by the collar of his windbreaker with both hands, shaking him with a terrifying, desperate strength. "You left her here." Lucinda screamed at me that I was a kidnapper when I had an open seat for her. "You sat right there, in that passenger seat, and you watched your wife leave that child in a Category 5 hurricane." "Logan, please, Lucinda is in jail. She ought to be under the jail." Mrs. Gable screamed from across the street, throwing her broom down. She marched over, her face dark with fury.
"We all saw it."
"Lucinda put that damn dog in the car and left Alice on the gravel. We all heard her say it would teach Jewel a lesson. It was the old way." Arthur suddenly shouted back, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "You all know the superstition. One twin takes the heat so the other survives. My grandmother did it. Lucinda's mother did it. If one doesn't pay, bad luck takes them both." A rock struck the side of the truck with a sharp, echoing bang. Arthur flinched and turned. Jewel was standing near the tailgate, a jagged piece of brick in her hand. Her face was hollow, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. "There was no superstition, Dad," Jewel said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the entire gathered crowd of Larkdon. "Mom just hated Alice. Because Alice looked like Grandma Parker, and Grandma Parker never gave Mom the house. Mom told me that when I was 7. She told me Alice was born to be my trash can." The crowd gasped. Several women covered their mouths. "Jewel, shut your mouth," Arthur pleaded, his eyes wild with terror. "Don't say things like that in front of everyone." "She held Alice's head in the river until my knees gave out," Jewel continued, stepping toward her father, dropping the brick into the mud with a wet thud. "She made Alice eat dry pasta until her gums bled because I didn't turn on the
stove.
And you sat at that kitchen table reading the newspaper, turning the pages louder so you wouldn't have to hear Alice choke." Logan let go of Arthur's collar. He looked at Arthur not with rage anymore, but with a disgust so profound that he stepped back 3 paces, as if Arthur were a rotting corpse. "Get out of this town, Arthur," Logan said, his voice deadly quiet.
Take your
truck. Take whatever isn't ruined in that house and get out.
If I see you on
This road after sundown, the police won't be the ones you need to worry about. Arthur looked around the circle of neighbors. Not a single person met his eyes. Even the younger men who had helped him repair his roof 2 summers ago crossed their arms, their jaws set, their eyes hard as flint. Arthur scrambled back into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and turned the
key.
The engine sputtered, roared, and he threw the truck into reverse, speeding away down the broken asphalt, leaving his youngest daughter standing alone in the ruins of their front yard. The interrogation room at the county precinct smelled of stale black coffee, damp drywall, and industrial bleach. Lucinda Parker sat at the metal table, her wrists still handcuffed to the steel loop bolted into the center. Her cardigan was stained, her hair unwashed, but her chin was tilted up at that same haughty, unyielding angle. Detective Miller, a woman in her late 40s with 20 years of homicide experience, sat across from her. Between them lay a manila folder thick with medical reports, transcripts, and a USB drive containing the hospital security footage. Mrs. Skinner, Detective Miller began, clicking her pen. Do you understand the charges being filed against you by the district attorney? This is ridiculous, Lucinda said smoothly. Second-degree murder? Child abuse, resulting in death. I am a mother. I have raised 2 honor roll students. I have never had a criminal record in my life. You left a 16-year-old child in an unreinforced wooden home during a mandatory Category 5 evacuation, Miller said, opening the folder. When a neighbor offered her a seat, you falsely accused him of attempted kidnapping to prevent her from boarding. When she was miraculously rescued by emergency volunteers and brought to the hospital in critical condition, you withheld medical consent for 22 minutes while her lungs filled with fluid. I was disciplining my child, Lucinda said, not blinking. Jewel has always been reckless. She lacks focus. She stayed out in a dangerous storm. In our family, we have a system. Alice understands her responsibility as the elder
twin.
If I don't show Jewel that actions have severe consequences, what kind of adult will she become? Detective Miller stared at her. For 10 long seconds, the detective didn't write anything. She just leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Your daughter is dead, Lucinda. She was weak, Lucinda snapped, her voice tightening with a sudden, vicious
edge.
If she had just held on to that pillar like I told her to, she would be
fine.
She gave up on purpose to spite me. She's been doing that since she was a toddler, crying just to make me look like a bad mother. The medical examiner's report came back this morning, Detective Miller said, ignoring her outburst. She pulled out an 8x10 glossy photograph and slid it across the metal table.
It was a close-up of my hands.
The fingernails on my left hand were completely torn off. Deep, bloody gouges ran along the flesh of my palms where I had clung to the rough concrete and brickwork under the kitchen counter until the flood surge ripped me away. Does that look like giving up to spite you? Miller asked. Lucinda looked down at the photograph. Her eyes twitched. For a split second, a muscle in her cheek jumped, but then her expression smoothed back into that rigid, stony denial. She always was dramatic, Lucinda muttered, turning her face away from the
picture.
She got that from her father's side. Detective Miller closed the folder with a sharp slap that echoed off the cinderblock walls. The district attorney is not offering a plea deal, Mrs. Skinner, Miller said. Quietly. We have the dispatch logs. We have the phone recording where your younger daughter pleaded with you while the house was collapsing and you told her to hang up because she was wasting minutes. We have the emergency room footage where you sat scrolling through social media videos while your child went into cardiac arrest 5 yards away. Miller stood up, looking down at Lucinda with cold contempt. You aren't a mother following an old superstition. You're a sadist who found a convenient excuse to torture a child you never wanted. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in a 6x8 cell thinking about whether Jewel learned her lesson. As Miller walked toward the door, Lucinda suddenly surged against the handcuffs, the steel rattling violently against the table. Where is Jewel? Lucinda screamed, her composure finally shattering into hysterical fury. Bring my daughter to me. She needs me. She won't survive a week without me telling her what to do. Bring Jewel here. The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off her screams. The town of Larkton did not wait for the court's verdict to pass its own judgment. Within 48 hours, the story broke on the county news, then was picked up by state television. A local news crew broadcasted live from outside the ruined Skinner House, showing the half-submerged kitchen counter where I had spent my final hours. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. People gathered outside the county courthouse holding candles, signs bearing my school portrait, the one where my smile looked forced because Mom had pinched my arm right before the camera flashed, and banners reading, "Justice for Alice Skinner." Arthur Skinner was arrested 3 days later at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the neighboring county. He was charged with felony child neglect and failure to report child abuse. When the deputies brought him in, he had 2 empty whiskey bottles in his passenger seat and a half-packed duffel bag. Jewel refused to stay with any of our maternal relatives. When our aunt, Brenda, Mom's sister, who had spent 16 years turning a blind eye to the bruises on my legs, came to claim guardianship, Jewel didn't even open the door of the youth shelter. Instead, Jewel went to the police precinct and asked to speak to the prosecutor. Prosecutor Vance was a sharp, meticulous man who had prosecuted domestic homicide for 15 years. He sat Jewel down in his office, offered her tea, and placed a recorder between them. "Jewel," Vance said gently, "you don't have to testify if the trauma is too severe. We have enough physical evidence and video footage to secure a conviction." "I want to testify," Jewel said. She pulled a small, worn canvas backpack onto her lap. It was my backpack, the one with the frayed strap that Mom had refused to replace for 3 years while buying Jewel a new leather satchel every September. Inside were 4 composition notebooks. "What are these?" Vance asked. "Alice kept logs," Jewel said, her voice steady, stripped of all 16-year-old inflection. "Every time Mom punished her for something I did, Alice wrote down the date, the time, what I did wrong, and what Mom did to her. She told me she was keeping a ledger. She said when we turned 18 we were going to run away to Seattle, and she was going to make Mom pay back every single dollar she saved by not feeding her." Vance slowly opened the first notebook. The handwriting on the earliest pages was large and clumsy, written by an 8-year-old hand. "March 14th. Jewel broke the blue vase in the hallway. Mom made me kneel on uncooked rice in the laundry room for 3 hours. Jewel cried. My knees bled on the floor. August 22nd. Jewel lost her math textbook. Mom took away my dinner for 4 days. Mr. Zane gave me an apple through the fence on day 3. November 3rd. Jewel didn't want to practice the piano. Mom closed the piano lid on my fingers. The doctor said 2 were fractured. Mom told the clinic I fell off the swing." As Vance turned page after page, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out, like cords on his neck. "There are 84 entries," Jewel said quietly. "From the time we were 8 until the day before the hurricane. The last entry was on Tuesday." Vance looked at the final page. September 28th. Jewel stayed out late at the diner with Mark and Sarah. "A storm is coming. Mom is pacing the floor. She told me to prepare myself, because Jewel was going to need a very big lesson this time. I am scared. The sky looks like bruised iron. I hope Jewel comes home soon so we can get it over with." Prosecutor Vance closed the notebook. He took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and took a long, shuddering breath. "Jewel," he said softly, "did you ever try to stop her?" Jewel looked down at her hands. The skin on her knuckles was raw from biting them during the long nights in the shelter. "When I was 10, I took a knife from the kitchen drawer and hid it under my mattress," Jewel whispered. "I told Mom that if she touched Alice again I would cut her while she was sleeping." "What happened?" Mom laughed, Jewel said, a tear finally escaping her eye and tracking through the dust on her cheek. "She didn't hit me. She locked Alice in the cellar for 3 days without a light bulb. She told me through the door, every breath Alice takes in the dark is because you held a knife. After that, I was too scared. Every time I made a mistake, I begged Mom to hit me instead. But Mom said hitting me wouldn't teach me anything. She said pain on your own body heals, but watching your sister bleed makes you obedient." Jewel looked directly into the prosecutor's eyes. "She didn't do it to protect me. She did it to turn me into her pet. And she turned Alice into the cage. They buried me on a crisp Tuesday morning in early October. The sun was out clear and golden, the kind of autumn light that makes the yellow birch leaves look like coins hanging from the branches. The ground was still damp from the historic flooding, but the cemetery on the high ridge overlooking Larkton was dry. Neither Lucinda nor Arthur was there. Their bail requests had been denied by the county judge on the grounds of extreme flight risk and danger to public welfare. Yet there were nearly 200 people standing among the headstones. Almost the entire surviving population of Larkdon had come. Women who had known me as the quiet girl who always walked 10 paces behind her sister. Teachers who remembered me staying late after school just to sit in the heated library. Shopkeepers who had secretly slipped extra cookies into my paper bags over the
Years.
Logan Zane stood at the front of the grave. He wore his only dark suit, the cuffs frayed from 20 years of church services. In his calloused hands he held a bouquet of wild yellow chrysanthemums he had gathered from the edge of the woods. When the minister finished the brief committal service, Logan stepped forward to the open grave. "Alice," the old man said, his voice trembling like a dry leaf in the autumn wind. "I'm sorry I let them pull me back into that truck. I should have jumped
Out.
I should have walked through that water and dragged you out of that kitchen myself." He laid the flowers upon the polished oak casket. "You were a good girl. You were the gentlest soul this town ever had, and we all failed you because we didn't want to get involved in another family's business. May God forgive us. I know I never will." Then Jewel stepped forward. She was dressed in a simple black sweater that had belonged to me. It was too large for her, the sleeves falling over her knuckles. She didn't carry flowers. She carried a small wooden box. She knelt beside the grave and opened the lid. Inside were 16 crisp $10 bills. Every single birthday gift Logan Zane had slipped into my pocket over the years, which I had hidden under a loose floorboard in the cellar, so Mom wouldn't take them to buy Jewel new dance shoes. "You saved every single one," Jewel said to the casket, her voice clear and unbroken. "You told me we were going to buy train tickets with this.
You said.
When we reached Seattle, we'd rent a room where the windows faced the ocean, and we'd buy 2 loaves of bread and eat them while they were still warm." Jewel placed the wooden box onto the casket lid. "I'm going to Seattle, Alice," Jewel said. "I'm buying the ticket,
I'm renting
the room, and I'm leaving the window open every single night, so the wind can
come in.
You don't have to hide under the counter anymore. You don't have to pay for me ever again." She stood up, turned her back on the open grave, and did not look back as she walked down the hill. The trial of the state versus Lucinda Parker Skinner and Arthur Skinner began 6 months later in the county seat's grand courtroom. The media called it the scapegoat trial. It drew legal scholars, child psychologists, and hundreds of spectators who queued outside the courthouse steps from 4 in the morning just to secure a seat in the gallery. Lucinda sat at the defense table wearing a muted gray blouse provided by her public defender. Her hair had gone largely white during her months in the county jail, but her eyes remained cold, sharp, and entirely unrepentant. Arthur sat 2 chairs away from her, his head hanging so low his chin touched his chest, refusing to look at his wife or the jury. The defense attorney attempted to build a case around severe generational psychosis and rural cultural delusion. He called an anthropologist to testify about ancient Appalachian and regional folk beliefs regarding twin curses and scapegoat rituals. Mrs. Skinner was not acting out of malice, the defense attorney argued to the jury. She was trapped in a deep-seated, irrational psychological framework, passed down through 4 generations of isolated rural culture. In her mind, she was performing an essential, protective sacrifice for the survival of her family. Then Prosecutor Vance stood up for the cross-examination. He didn't call the anthropologist back to the stand. He didn't summon psychological experts. He simply called one witness, Jewel Skinner. When Jewel walked through the courtroom doors, the entire gallery went silent. She was 17 now, taller, her hair cut short, her face bearing that unmistakable, haunting symmetry that had always made people confuse the two of us from a distance. When Lucinda saw Jewel walk down the aisle, her face lit up with a bizarre, triumphant smile. "Jewel," Lucinda called out from the defense table, half rising before the bailiff placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Jewel, look at you. Tell these
People.
Tell them how much I loved you. Tell them everything I did was to keep you safe." Jewel walked past the defense table without a single flicker of recognition in her eyes. She looked at Lucinda the way a person looks at a stain on the sidewalk. She took the oath, sat in the witness box, and adjusted the microphone. "Jewel," Prosecutor Vance said gently, "your mother's defense claims that her actions were rooted in an ancient family belief that one twin must absorb the misfortune of the other. Did your mother ever explain this belief to you?" "No," Jewel said. "What did she tell you?" "She told me that Alice was a mistake," Jewel replied, her voice ringing clearly through the cavernous courtroom. She told me that when she was pregnant, the doctor told her she was having one child. When Alice came out first, the doctor said there was another heartbeat. Mom said Alice stole 4 minutes of her life. That belonged to me. A murmur rippled through the jury box. Did she ever punish Alice when you did something well? Vance asked. Never, Jewel said. When I won the 5th grade spelling bee, Mom took me out for ice cream. When we got home, she made Alice wash all the windows on the 2nd floor from the outside ledge because Alice only got 3rd place in the science fair. Mom said 3rd place was an insult to the family name. Vance turned toward the defense table. And during the hurricane?
When the
evacuation orders came? Mom told Alice to go find me in the storm, Jewel said, looking directly at the 12 jurors. She knew where I was. I was at Sarah's house 2 doors down. Sarah's mother called our landline 20 minutes before the sirens went off to tell Mom I was there. Mom told Sarah's mother to keep me there until the wind picked up because she wanted Alice to go out in the dark. The defense attorney leaped to his feet. Objection. Hearsay. We have Sarah's mother's phone records and sworn deposition entered as Exhibit D, Your Honor, Vance said without missing a beat. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed in dark disgust. Overruled. Vance turned back to Jewel. Why did she want Alice to go out in the dark, Jewel? Because, Jewel said, her voice dropping into a register of chilling, absolute certainty. Mom wanted Alice to get caught in the storm.
she didn't want to
Bring 2 daughters to the city. She only ever wanted one. At the defense table, Lucinda suddenly broke. She slammed both palms against the polished oak table, knocking over her water glass, and screamed at the witness stand. You ungrateful little bitch. I gave you everything. I made her bleed so you wouldn't have to. I took every bruise meant for you and put it on her back.
You
Would have been nothing without me. You would have drowned in that river if I hadn't taught her how to choke. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, several people stood up shouting, and the judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Restrain the defendant, the judge ordered. 2 bailiffs forced Lucinda down into her chair, but she continued to thrash. Her face purple, saliva flying from her lips as she glared at Jewel with pure, venomous hatred. You think you're free of her? Lucinda shrieked as they forced the handcuffs back onto her wrists. Every time you look in the mirror, you'll see her face. You killed her. You stayed out late. You wrote the letter. Her blood is on your hands, Jewel. On your hands. Jewel sat in the witness box, perfectly still, watching the woman who had birthed her be dragged out of the courtroom by 3 armed officers. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. When the heavy doors closed behind Lucinda, Jewel looked at the jury and said, quietly, I am finished with my testimony. The jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes. When they returned, the verdict was read in a dead-silent courtroom. Lucinda Parker Skinner, guilty of murder in the 2nd degree with depraved indifference. Guilty of felony child abuse resulting in death. Guilty of endangering the welfare of a child. The judge did not show an ounce of mercy. During sentencing, he looked down from the bench at Lucinda, who stood flanked by 2 guards, her face tight and sullen. In my 32 years on the bench, the judge said, his voice echoing off the high plaster ceilings, I have seen crimes of passion, crimes of greed, and crimes of sheer madness. But I have rarely seen a cruelty so cold, so systematic, and so utterly devoid of human conscience as what you inflicted upon your daughter Alice. You attempted to cloak your sadism in the guise of maternal discipline and ancient superstition. But the law does not recognize cruelty as culture.
You
sacrificed a child who loved you, who obeyed you, and who bore your violence in silence for 16 years. You will spend the rest of your natural life in the state maximum security facility for women. You will not be eligible for parole. You will live out your days knowing that the daughter you tried to mold has rejected you entirely, and the daughter you destroyed will outlive your name in the memory of this
community.
Arthur Skinner was sentenced to 12 years for felony child neglect and manslaughter by omission. As they led him away in chains, he wept openly, begging the empty gallery for forgiveness that no one was left to give. 2 years later, in a small, quiet neighborhood in North Seattle, the morning air smelled of salt water, cedar, and roasting coffee beans. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building overlooking Puget
Sound.
The walls were painted a clean, pale cream. The hardwood floors were bare, except for a braided wool rug in front of the sofa. Jewel stood by the open kitchen counter, making breakfast. She turned on the gas stove, set a small pot of water to boil, and carefully measured out a cup of rolled oats. Beside the stove lay a cutting board with fresh strawberries sliced into neat, even halves. She was 19 now. She worked at a botanical nursery near the waterfront during the day and took night classes in landscape architecture at the community college. Every month on the 1st, a check arrived in the mail, survivors' compensation, and the liquidated assets from the sale of the Skinner land in Larkton, which Logan Zane had overseen and forced through probate court on her behalf.
Jewel
never touched the money for herself. She used it to pay the tuition of 3 young girls from domestic abuse shelters across the state, enrolled in trade programs under an anonymous scholarship named the Alice Skinner Foundation. Jewel poured the oatmeal into 2 ceramic bowls. She set one bowl at the small table by the window, where the morning breeze came in off the water, cool and sharp, carrying the distant cry of gulls. She set the second bowl across the table, placed a silver spoon beside it, and set a small dish of brown sugar between them. She sat down, picked up her spoon, and looked out across the gray-blue expanse of the water, where the ferry was slowly carving a white line toward Bainbridge Island. "The wind is nice today, Alice," Jewel said quietly to the empty chair. The lace curtain fluttered gently in the salt draft. A single sunbeam broke through the morning fog, striking the surface of the steam rising from the second bowl of hot oatmeal, turning it golden, warm, and entirely peaceful. And in that quiet room high above the water, where no storm could ever reach us. Again, the ledger was finally closed.